They are. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
You can be very enthusiastic with Vivian, by the way. Come on, say hi, Vivian.
Hi, and hey,
Okay,
Brad, I
that's
see you hiding over there behind the projector. Hi, Brad.
Didn't hide well enough, apparently.
Okay, great. Okay, now I don't know where to stand, but anyway, I think I'll sit and give it. Okay, so Vivian, I gave a bit of a introduction to you. I didn't get a chance to show them Dr. Blog yet, but I can do that later. Vivian and I worked together at State Polytechnic, and at that point, Vivian was the director of the Center for Instructional Technology and Development. Really, I enjoyed working with her, learned a lot from Vivian. Vivian has had experience at BCIT, SAIT, University of British Columbia, Mount Royal University, and now she is at Royal Roads. And I read your title a lot earlier. I'm really pleased that Vivian's joined us because I think this can be a great opportunity for her to answer some questions. I've got some questions prepared, but I've told her that you folks are not shy and would likely find this an opportunity maybe to ask some challenging questions that Vivian would do her best to answer. So, is there anything you want to say in way of introduction before I fire the first question at you, Vivian?
I think I've got a bit of a sense. I take it that all of you are in some kind of senior administrative position at various universities across Canada. Do I have that correct?
Some are and some aren't. Some are instructors at different institutions. Some are doing different kinds of leadership responsibilities. We sort of have a range here.
Okay. Great, but faculty, administration, and senior leadership.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
And institutional planning.
Oh, okay, great.
And not just universities.
And not just in Canada.
And not just in Canada. One from United Arab Emirates University and one from University of Calgary and Qatar.
Oh, wonderful. Great diverse group, it sounds like.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question I have for you is, based on the wealth of experience that you've had at post-secondary institutions, what are some of the common themes that you have seen across those institutions when it comes to the effective implementation of learning technologies?
Well, I'd say one of the themes is even in the year 2013, where technology should be like the bread and butter of our life, is I think institutions are still grappling with technology-enabled teaching and learning, because it is such a complex topic, because it has significant budget ramifications, and because it shakes up the culture of universities. So, I've been in this bit prior to my life and working in universities. I also did work in the K-12 sector from about 1995 to the year 2000. So I've been in this business of technology-enabled learning really since 1995. And boy, I must have been very naive back then because working in the K-12 sector, I actually thought that with the advent of the internet that we would be able to have adoption and diffusion of integrating technology into teaching and learning relatively quickly because of the power of the internet. But what I didn't know, and I've certainly learned over the years, is that the politics of adoption and diffusion far supersede the technical issues. And so I'm sure all of you have run into that in your respective capacities. So in terms of that bigger picture of what's the status, I would say it's very much dependent on individual institutions and the culture and the budget situation. There's no question that universities across Canada are all under siege these days from a fiscal point of view. The draconian issues that have happened in Alberta recently with the memorandums of understanding that have created all kinds of problems. Budget is a big issue, and so you can talk all you want about highfalutin ideas of integrating technology into pedagogy, but if there isn't appropriate budget support for that kind of stuff, it sort of is left to the to the innovation of individuals rather than institutional innovation.
Okay. Yeah, that's something you see everywhere you go then, it sounds like.
Everywhere I've been. And I mean, even at big, fancy University of British Columbia, which is an incredible place to work and learn, I'll just give you a hint on that. Is there anybody in the room from University of British Columbia?
Spent time there.
Spent time there. So just as an example, I'll give you just a story. I worked for the Sauder School of Business at UBC, which has about 400 faculty and staff. It's a fairly significant faculty, about the size of some universities actually. And it was part of, obviously, the greater whole of UBC. I had, for 3 years, a fairly significant budget to do things related to learning management systems and that sort of thing. And also I was responsible for more general information technology agenda related to improving business processes. But in the university as a whole, UBC has dabbled with online and technology-enabled learning for many years. They were part of, they have been part of that Universitas 21 back from about the year 1999 or 2000, with ambitious rhetoric about e-learning, but not a whole lot that was actually happening. It's only 4 months ago that Stephen Toop, the president of UBC, called together a town hall and basically proclaimed a mandate for flexible learning at UBC, and nobody actually has said e-learning per se, because that's politically, I think, a loaded term. What most people interpret flexible learning to be at UBC at this stage is an integration of both flexible access from many perspectives and e-learning, but they don't call it that. And that only happened 4 months ago. And there is some associated budget that is going on with that, and UBC is dabbling in MOOCs. They have 3 or 4 MOOCs that they've done with Coursera. But even in a large institution like that, adoption and diffusion of e-learning and all of the associated instructional design capacity that would go with that is still, it's somewhat underdeveloped. So that's in a big, well-funded university. And as those of us that have also worked in small universities, I mean, my time at Mount Royal University, I was there for a contract recently. Mount Royal really got hit hard by the Alberta budget cuts, and they struggle to keep this kind of stuff alive. They have approximately 200 courses that are delivered online at Mount Royal University, but a real struggle to maintain budget for instructional designers and the back-end support of the Blackboard learning platform in order to accommodate it. So, you know, whether you're small or big, the budget thing and the tying it to institutional policy is still, we're still in a struggle mode, even though the internet's been around for a good 20 years in this capacity.
Interesting. So what are you seeing then in terms of, from the other end of it, from a faculty perspective? What about faculty adoption? Have you seen models of professional development that have grabbed the attention of educators and have been particularly successful in helping them to integrate learning technologies?
You know, that is probably one of the biggest challenges, is even if you've got the fiscal capacity to put in place tools and technologies at an institutional level, the faculty adoption thing is still a huge challenge. Most universities have tried to run all kinds of faculty development workshops on this particular topic and have lunch and learns and that kind of thing. And everywhere that I've been, there's been huge effort put into offering that kind of stuff to faculty, but quite frankly, rather spotty uptake. And that's not because faculty aren't interested. It's because they don't have time and there aren't the associated rewards and recognition for them to participate in this kind of stuff. And I mean, you folks are into the literature, you're well aware of this, I'm quite sure. That as long as in a research university you are rewarded for publications, but not for teaching, and especially not for teaching in a technology-enabled way, it's really difficult to get faculty to really rally to the cause on this. Now, the stuff that does seem to work and where I do see very wide innovation is faculty, the old bell curve of the faculty, the 20% that want to take it on themselves. They're doing very interesting things, and probably the best way that I've seen to support faculty in their journey is on a one-to-one basis. At many of the institutions that I've been involved with, I've either led or tried to create faculty drop-in centers. So, for example, at SAIT, Brad, you'll recall, we tried to get that collaboratory underway, which was intended as a drop-in facility for faculty where they didn't have to come to formal faculty training sessions, but they could drop in and have access to a range of expertise, whether it be instructional designers or interactive media technologists or whatever, to assist them with integrating innovation into how they were delivering their courses. I think one-on-one in those kinds of facilities and services are actually the best way, because it's really difficult to get people to come to faculty development workshops. When I was at Mount Royal, they have quite a mature model for this. They have two, shall I say, storefront services available. They have something called the Sandbox, which is for faculty. It's a faculty drop-in center. And of course, sitting behind the curtain of Sandbox is a team of about 20 people that do faculty development, instructional design, and educational technology. So at any given point in time when they come into the Sandbox, if their questions or support requirements are grander than what the person that basically is the front man for that, he just goes and gets other expertise. And I think it works exceptionally well, and it's become one of those easy to come to, easy to find your friends kind of center. At Mount Royal, in addition to Sandbox, they run a service called the START Lab, which is a very similar thing designed for students, staffed by students. And I think this is actually one of the most powerful things. So both Sandbox and the START Lab were under my responsibility when I was at Mount Royal. And I just thought it was the most powerful thing I've seen, because together we were talking about the same technologies, whether it be for students or for faculty, but with the different audiences, and building up knowledge and capacity within both of those communities. And where the real power, I think, for change comes in higher ed for broad adoption and diffusion of this kind of stuff is actually through the students. If the students are all using Google Docs, but their professors aren't, the students become the call to action for adoption of tools that are productivity tools or whatever. And so, quite frankly, I'm sort of tired of pleading for faculty development. My new trick is to engage with learners, the students, and have them become the agents of change for, dare I say, demanding that their professors do things in ways that work with what both millennials and what the contemporary technology scene expects. And that seems to be a great toehold in making change happen.
Wow, that's really interesting. Anybody here want to comment on that approach?
It's good. I like it.
But can I just, Vivian, can I just ask you a couple of, I just want to just ask you a question based on some of what you've put forward.
Hey, Doug, move
Yes.
the camera so I can see who's talking.
We can certainly
Aha.
hear your enthusiasm and advocacy for moving on to technology. Have a bit of a background myself in telecom, and one of my classmates does here as well. And I wonder sometimes if there isn't a tendency for people who are familiar with the technology to overestimate how quickly the transition and ramp up might occur. Because you did say the internet's been available for over 20 years, but that's not actually the case. I mean, it wasn't until 1995 that the federal government actually put in place the regulatory regime to make networks available. And I did work for TELUS during the 90s, and I know it was until 1997 that we actually celebrated the fact that we had our 100,000th customer who had internet access. So, we overestimate how much how much change has actually had to occur amongst the people who are actually using the technologies, as opposed to the starting point that the technologists themselves might actually be at. So the level of the length of time has been shorter than we might really appreciate. I mean, we might be hitting that. We've probably only just started to hit the critical mass where the broader technologies and their practical applications are on the minds of the people who are actually instructing and teaching in our higher education institutions.
I think that's a really important point, and I think that what we've seen happen in the last 3 to 5 years is a change maker in terms of the easy access to lightweight apps and the whole Google world that makes it very easy for everybody to gain access to things. Because you're right, I have a yellow suit, business suit, that I have in my closet that I no longer fit into, I might add, that I've had in my closet since 1994. And the reason I kept it all these years is not because I wear it, but because that was the suit that I wore at the first internet conference that I spoke at in 1994 in Vancouver. So you're absolutely right with the dates. The last 5 years with both the kinds of apps we see on mobile devices, Androids, iPhones, and iPads, and the easy integration of those into people's personal productivity, and the world of Google, which I think is a major change maker, I think does change the game. Because part of the problem, not just the internet, but, we've all been involved, or those of us that work in higher ed, have all been involved with the evolution of the learning management system from its early rudimentary stuff of WebCT and its first iteration through to Blackboard, and then the highly competitive market between Blackboard, Desire to Learn, and then the advent of tools like Moodle and Sakai. But you're right. The broad-based access of these tools really is only in maybe the last 6 to 8 years, not certainly in the last 20. So I think your point is well taken. But I would also say that this stuff is so ubiquitous and we all use it every day in our own personal lives. So I ask the question, why is it always so challenging to move from the personal use of these tools into collaborative and cohort-based use of these tools, which is what we do in a teaching and learning environment?
Well, I think partly it's how we define all, because as an instructor in my classroom, if I actually do a straw poll around my students, the number of students who are millennials, and you ask them, do you use these tools? The number is smaller in practice in the classroom than the literature would have us believe.
Yeah.
So it's, as impatient as those who love technology might be, it is taking longer for so many practical reasons, which are the users themselves.
Yeah. I would agree.
Okay, Perry?
I just want to augment Cindy's.
Oh, she's behind the
I
projector.
just want to augment
Hi there.
comment. To answer your question, I'm sitting here thinking, like, why do faculty resist change? And Cindy and I were actually talking about this at lunch today, and I think she made an excellent point in our discussion at lunch in that instructors are evaluated based on their teaching performance. And I think not knowing the technology, or perhaps the fear of failure, I mean, the same reason why we don't want to change anything, because of that fear of failure, particularly in front of a class where you're vulnerable. I think that could be a large reason as well.
Oh, you're so right. And that student evaluation of instruction, or whatever the various institutions call this, I mean, faculty, when they are evaluated on their student evals, and if in fact they are taking innovation risks, and the first time they deliver a course it doesn't go perfectly because they're playing with a little bit of risk, and then if depending on what the leadership style is of a particular institution, whether there is an accommodation for innovation or not, is a huge impediment to this. So you're absolutely right. There's lots of faculty that who know that they are going to be judged on their student evaluations would prefer just to keep things as they are. So it seems to me from a policy perspective, especially in post-secondary institutions that are not research-based but are teaching and learning institutions, you know, like the colleges and that sort of thing, that it would be really helpful to build into faculty evaluation some kind of metrics around risk-taking and innovation, because as long as it is just a popularity contest with students in the student evals, it's very, very difficult to have people take those kinds of risks. And you know, I've been involved in a few action research projects over the years where we've looked at what it takes for successful adoption and diffusion of a tool in a course or classroom situation. And you know, the complexity, as I'm sure all of you are aware, is huge. You know, just for example, let's say I'm just going to use a really simple one, using Google Docs as a way to collaborate and share knowledge building and report out on that in a particular discipline area. That sounds relatively simple when I say it. The issues are, there's a multitude of issues that can inhibit the success of that simple little line item. And you know, facilitating collaborative work. And I use the word facilitating because I really think the role of teachers and professors and instructors with these kinds of tools needs to shift from broadcast teaching into a facilitation role. So unless we are rewarding teachers for moving on their own path through developing the skills for facilitation in those technology-mediated collaborative environments using tools like Google Docs or whatever, those things run risk of failure because it's really difficult for faculty that don't have experience in real facilitation to know how to make those kinds of environments work effectively. So it goes back to the faculty development thing. How do we shift the model of how we teach from old style, you know, sage on the stage, give a lecture, hand out some PowerPoints or whatever, to something that is really about facilitating knowledge building through collaborative processes. And that is a skill set that not everybody comes to the table with. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done with faculty to help them build those skills.
David, do you have any idea, have you any sense at all from the research that you've done, how many people who work in the IT support areas have actually spent time in a classroom?
Well, that's an interesting point. Usually the IT people per se don't have a classroom background, they have an IT background. You know, but the units that I run are typically ones that are focused on educational technology and instructional design, and those people, many of them, have a background in teaching. In fact, many of the places I've worked, our instructional designers don't get hired unless they have at least a master's in education and have teaching experience. So the IT people sitting, you know, behind the help desk and managing the servers and that kind of stuff, no, those people don't have a teaching background.
But I think that that's one of the disconnects in the system. I think there needs to be a greater interface between Centers for Teaching and Learning and IT and faculty who are willing to take risks. And I know in my own experience as a faculty member, whenever I am taking a risk with a new technology and it doesn't go well, the IT person is nowhere to be found. So I think there's a piece missing with those IT people maybe coming into more of a supportive role, maybe proactive as opposed to reactive.
Well, and that is such a great point, and it comes back to budget. It's not a lack of will, it's a lack of budget, and I'll give you some examples. So and I'll talk just about the IT people that have very specific skills of coming over to your computer or computers that are in a classroom setting, or you know, being able to troubleshoot stuff at distance. That is a one-on-one help thing. And that requires a lot of bodies. And this is why that model that I mentioned at Mount Royal I found so impressive. In the START lab at Mount Royal, we had about 20 students that we employed. And I also had this at UBC. And I would deck these young people out in colorful vests that you could see coming down, you could see them from a kilometer away coming down the hall towards you. And these people were runners. And faculty had basically a help number, 4497, call help. And these young people would be dispatched literally to run to a classroom, to fix the AV equipment, to reload something on a computer, to do whatever is required. And I actually think that kind of just-in-time support is critical, because as things get more and more complex with the integration of AV, computer, other classroom technologies like the stuff you see with Crestrons on the podiums and that kind of stuff. And if you're an instructor or a lecturer or a professor, you've got anywhere from 30 to 300 people in the room sometimes. You don't have time to troubleshoot these issues. You need somebody at your side. And so I'm a real advocate of creating units where you give students experiential learning by being part of this kind of a service model as an extension of the IT department, because there's no way that anybody can afford to do this with full-time, with FTEs that are doing it. An AV technician that runs to the classroom, those people all make $50,000. Some of them more. You can't afford to have 20 of those people being ready to run. But most institutions can come up with ways and have fund matching and grant matching mechanisms to basically bring students into that kind of thing who, lots of them know how to do this just in their DNA, even if they don't know how to play on the internet per se, like the other speaker mentioned. And I think it's a very powerful model to build capacity to support adoption and diffusion and reduce the risk for faculty that things will go sour.
Brett?
Hi, Vivian. It's Brad. Good to see you again.
Hi, Brad.
You mentioned earlier about the Google-type applications, a number of the applications that are now available, including LMSs for free. Where do you see kind of the software side of the learning systems going? Are we moving towards a free open source platform? And if so, what are the pros and cons of doing it?
Well, nothing's free. It might be free to download the software onto your servers, but then you have to play with it. So right now I manage a team of people that support Moodle. And of course Moodle is an open source free environment. But I would say that it takes a minimum of 3 system analyst type people to keep the Moodle system alive. So that is almost equivalent to the cost of licensing an LMS from Canvas or Blackboard or whatever, depending on the size of institution that you're in. And there's lots of issues with these open source tools because of the lack of systematic approach to new rev releases and that kind of thing. So as much as I really like the Moodle environment that I'm currently involved with, I have no blinders on that it's free, for heaven's sakes. As it relates to things like the more personal productivity tools like what we see in Google and that kind of thing, I think those things require somewhat less support. And once again, the example that I've given you with what I saw at Mount Royal is one of the 2 institutions in Alberta that's gone Google. University of Alberta and Mount Royal have both done that. It's interesting how Alberta has less of a rigorous approach to to FOIP compared to other Canadian provinces. Here in British Columbia, it's very, very difficult to get some of this FOIPs, this stuff with those kinds of tools underway. So if you're in Alberta, take advantage of the opportunity. I'm a believer that even with all the cool tools of Google, we still need learning management systems. And the reason I say that is the big, powerful thing that a learning management system does is it manages a lot of that identity management to actually create cohorts that you have a bounded wall around. So if you have, Biology 100 being taught 3 times in 1 year and maybe in multi-section courses, you need to manage the cohorts within each of those Biology 100 courses. And one group may be 6 weeks ahead of the other, and it's very difficult if you're exposing everybody to all the content all the time. I think there's a really important value of what a learning management system does in terms of managing identity within cohorts and also being able to effectively manage the sequencing of when you release modules for your learners to engage with. If you just have all of this stuff in Google this and Google that, it's very, very difficult to manage the selective release and the cohort activities within those kinds of more open tools. So I think the LMS still has a huge value in our classic institutional environments.
Great, thanks.
Marion?
I like that you brought up Google. I think it's interesting because I have a couple of friends who are educators and they've had the opportunity to go to some huge Google conferences. I'm wondering if you've had any other experiences or any experience with the actual systems or these organizations giving free training or giving training to organizations who've chosen to use their technologies, or what your opinion on that would be?
Well, certainly my experience at Mount Royal with the Google project was 100% positive. Basically what happens is Google works with post-secondary institutions to set up an overall Google instance within your environment. So you're not really, you kind of have a private environment for managing all your email addresses for your students and that kind of thing. Mount Royal used to have one of those, most of them are kind of wonky student email systems that nobody liked. So, but basically what they did was they moved all of the accounts from those old funky email systems into Google. So students might have both a personal Gmail address and their Mount Royal University Gmail address. Google provided a lot of support to Mount Royal in getting that set up. And then in terms of the use cases of these tools, we trained up the 20 or so students that I had working in that START lab. We had a very intense 2 weeks, actually last August. Mount Royal launched their Google stuff last September. And in August, we brought the student team in and basically went through all of the Google apps and talked about use cases and gave the team basically some hands-on training in some basic principles of file management and that kind of thing within the Google environment, and then we just let it rip. And it's been, I think, an incredibly successful project. But now, I'm going to give you one of the downsides of what I've seen in this Google environment. How many of you use Google Docs as part of how you manage your own stuff and share stuff? Do people in this room do that? Okay. So you'll be familiar with how ugly Google file folder stuff is. And when you start getting a whole bunch of people playing in Google folders, it just becomes like a complete dog's breakfast really fast. And I don't have a solution for that, but that was just one of the things that I became aware of when you open up, we'll call it open collaborative spaces in a tool like Google, and you say, everybody get in here and let her rip and let's share docs and let's create stuff. And within 2 months you have such a mess of file folder stuff that you just dream of the good old days when you had somebody in your organization that was a records management or document management person to help get some order to the chaos. So it's just something to be aware of. I mean, there are some workarounds, but it's really hard to corral the cats when it comes to the proliferation of Google file folders and how you actually deal with it. The other thing that we became aware of at Mount Royal is there was a lot of stuff that was being developed in Google Docs, both in terms of the learners and with faculty and with the administrators. Everybody's doing shared Google Docs. So then what happens with those Google Docs when, you know, they've moved from draft into final? Does that stuff actually then get moved over into like an Outlook file server or a Windows file server environment, or maybe SharePoint or some other document management tool? Because I think there's a lot of concern that all of this stuff just lives in this crazy Google world and anybody could go in at any time and muck with it. And it kind of is a call to action for thinking about a new age of institutional records management when everybody's playing in Google Docs. And I don't have the solution for it, but it was something I observed at Mount Royal that was sooner or later somebody was going to have to address this proliferation.
Just while you were talking, I was just trying to find a document. It's a document called Going Google in Alberta.
Yeah.
And were you part of that, building that document?
No, I think that one, there's that AHEIT group in Alberta, Alberta Higher Education and Information Technology Group, and they were the ones that I believe authored that document, the CIO at U of A and the CIO and other people at Mount Royal.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about collaboration amongst higher ed institutions. What have you seen happening there? What do you envision as being some models that might work, or is there need for it?
Oh, I'm big on this topic. It's actually really interesting because I've worked extensively in both Alberta and BC, and also I've got lots of pals in Ontario. So each province seems to have a different way of fostering collaboration. For those of you who are from Alberta, please don't take this personally, but I found that in Alberta, the eCampus Alberta community isn't sticky enough. And then, of course, the recent announcements by the minister related to Campus Alberta, instead of creating a desire for collaboration, that seemed to create a whole mess of policy issues. And I see from one of my alerts in the last 2 weeks that I believe, Brad, you're probably part of this, that many post-secondary institutions in Alberta have kind of risen up around this Campus Alberta idea to say, what is this? We don't even have any policy docs to tell us what our role is. Do you want to comment on that, Brad?
Well, that's actually quite true. The Auditor General's report that was released 2 weeks ago was very damning on enterprise and advanced education for not defining what Campus Alberta actually is.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, meanwhile, over on the other side of the Rockies in BC, there are two groups that are very active in creating collaboration, BC Campus and BC Net. And BC Net would be like the, what do you call it in Alberta, the SuperNet research network. BC Campus has been very successful through basically a granting process, a grant application process for creating shared momentum both around course development that can be shared amongst various institutions and also various other sort of action research initiatives. They've now morphed their process from funding shared course development to this massive initiative that they've got underway with open textbooks. And many institutions in the province are very actively involved in participating in this Open Educational Resources Open Textbook Initiative. So that's an example of, I think, some very powerful collaboration. And the time is well due on this particular part of the high cost of public education, and that is those $300 textbooks that we ask our students to purchase that are used only for a few months. Other things that I see in collaboration and that I think are really important is the movement towards shared services. I have never understood why every single post-secondary institution thinks that they are so unique that they couldn't possibly use some common servers or even share some applications. We all really have almost the same business model, and I know that it might be politically dangerous for me to say this, but I actually think that if the Alberta government has not done a good job of saying why Campus Alberta, but I think the idea behind the scenes is to create more of a momentum around shared services, and I think that's a good thing because everybody's running hither and thither looking for their own cloud services. Why not do it as a group and get economies of scale and problem solve together? The cost of IT infrastructure is huge, and a shared services model, I think, really makes sense. So those are two examples of collaboration, and it would be nice if institutions could get over thinking that they are so unique that they cannot possibly share what they're doing with other institutions to get some economies of scale. I always say the femur is the femur is the femur. And I've been involved with the course development of, like these introductory biology courses where people think that their view of the femur is somehow very unique from the way anatomy and physiology is taught in every other institution. And I think this is just a silly misuse of resources, and that's why open textbook and shared courseware development, I think, is really important.
What about the benefit of competition between universities to actually try to push their own materials better? If you are sharing materials and sharing course design, what motivation does the university have to actually improve their own materials past another competitors?
Well, I would argue that your competitive advantage is not in the commodity of a Biology 100 course. Your competitive advantage is in what kind of flexible access, tuition, the kinds of faculty you have and the kinds of student support you have. That's where your competitive advantage lies. It's not in teaching standard undergraduate courses. And if that's what we think is our competitive advantage, then MOOCs will take off. I actually think MOOCs are much ado about nothing, quite frankly. But if we think that, I see people chuckling about that comment. I think we need to find our competitive advantage in ways beyond the commodity of the actual course. A great way to establish competitive advantage is through the excellence of your instructors.
Which are invested in the list.
Unless you have extremely poor instructors. So I actually have a different, very different context in that I'm in the Middle East. We have 3 institutions, all that had been pushed together to work together to create shared courses to a degree, and basically that lasted for about 6 months. And now we've all splintered our own ways. We see ourselves as trying to, take as many students as we can, and since we feel that we do this better than the other institutions, my institution I should say, we don't want to give them all of our hard work in order to have them take students away from us, and therefore we lose our jobs. So that's my institution's kind of current position. So I was interested in.
Well, and I think that that's a really good example. I mean, you folks are enrolled in an EdD and you're talking about leadership, and this is really a question of leadership. And within the domains of institutional and system-wide educational delivery, we need leadership around this. And I'll go back to Lukasik as the minister in Alberta. I think they've got the right idea, but they've really failed in their communication and delivery of what they're trying to do with Campus Alberta. If, in fact, these things are to recognize that the competitive advantage of institutions and the target market is unique, there's a big difference between Medicine Hat College and the University of Alberta, and they attract a completely different kind of learner. And I think that there's oodles of opportunity for distinction within each of those sectors. But it's not about those standard courseware things. I mean, I think if you went and looked at a Harvard or a Stanford entry-level anatomy and physiology course, it probably would be very similar to what is taught at Red Deer College. They just happen to have Nobel Prize winning people that are somehow associated with it. They don't actually teach it, their TAs teach it. But their competitive advantage is based on brand recognition of a big name and attracting top drawer faculty. It's not based on their anatomy and physiology course.
Interesting.
You're right.
There you go. Brad liked that. Man?
I know you've got a Harvard-style anatomy and physiology over there, Brad, right?
Might have been Princeton.
Two small questions, one comment and question. The first is another competitive advantage, you talked about flexibility, is course scheduling and condensed versions of courses. such as this one, so we can come for 2 weeks in the summer and make it work in our lives. My question for you is coming out of yesterday's in vivo demonstration from afar. Can you give us in vivo's competitors? Do you know any? Because I want to. I want to know another program or two that's used in qualitative analysis.
And does it cost $600?
Well, just exploring options, let's say.
That's interesting. The only one that I'm familiar with is in vivo,
Okay.
but I'm sure there must be other ones, but I'm not familiar with them.
Okay, thank you.
And of course, that stuff, that's an interesting question though in the bigger context. That's part of the suite of products that sits on both the research side of the house and what I'll call the library services side of the house, with tools, you know, for, what's the one called, for the citation thing that everybody uses, and Noteworks and all those kinds of things. Yeah. So that's the other range of, we'll call it technologies that post-secondary institutions get involved with. And it's always interesting. Those tools typically are barely managed by anybody. They are kind of available and you can download them. But if you need support, in most institutions I've been involved with, it's kind of like you have to figure it out yourself. I don't know, has anybody been in an institution where they've had significant support for in vivo?
No, actually, what was implied yesterday with our session, Vivian, was that they do have some online resources, but they also have some fee-for-service training that they will provide.
Right.
On campus here, I'm not sure if there's, I think there is a support person you could contact, but I haven't seen actual training sessions here.
Well, Doug, I think that could be the next evolution of what we call Dr. Blog.
Dr. in vivo.
And seriously, because, you know, what Doug did for me when I was over at the Sauder School of Business in his role of Dr. Blog was absolutely fabulous. And
we didn't have time to get to that. Maybe you can just explain that to them.
So, at the Sauder School of Business, we were keen to introduce WordPress blogs so that students could basically keep a reflective practice journal about a whole bunch of things. And we didn't really have any hands-on people that could either had time or expertise to support the kinds of questions that students would have on making their blogs better. And back to the comment that the lady in telecom mentioned, is that just because they're millennials doesn't mean that they know how to blog. And so I brought Doug on a contract basis, and we rebranded him, and we called him Dr. Blog. And he had a website, and he just kind of kept, the students who were all part of this thing using blogs knew that if they needed some help, they could just go to Dr. Blog and either ask questions. It would be like office hours, if you will. And also, Doug was maintaining some really good frequently asked questions. And so the support of the blog thing actually was done on a virtual basis. It was really effective. And I think those kinds of little pieces to support technology adoption are really handy. And I'm sorry, Doug, it didn't cost Sauder a lot, but I know you did, and I know you didn't get rich on it, but it was a really valuable service.
Yeah, maybe you can also talk about the some of the other. This actually was for first year BCom students, and you had about 600 students a year were coming into the program. So this was managing large numbers of students who all had a common core competency course that they had to take, which was an overview of all the, basically a precursor with a little bit of marketing, finance, accounting, etc., etc. And so a lot of guest speakers were coming in, and then the students were blogging in response to certain questions that they were asked to comment on when the guest speakers were in. But they also developed a back channel to WordPress so that students could do microblogging. So, because Twitter was something that we were using, but then there was the issue of the cloud. Where is this information sitting? A privacy issue. So this was done in-house, something called Pulse Press. So that was another piece to it. And then students were also using clickers, audience response systems in the classroom. So it was part of a larger initiative that you were trying to really engage these students right off the bat when they hit this BCom program. And then you were just describing to me a little bit the kind of classroom that this was all taking place in. Do you want to just share a story about that?
Yeah, so there was a lot of stuff going on in this large lecture theater. This was a lecture theater that probably seats 200, probably 200 students. And it had the large screens at the front, vanity monitors at the bottom so that the instructor could see what slides were up. The room had one microphone for every 2 seats, and the microphones were tied to cameras in the room. And so when you press the thing to say you want to talk, a light comes up, and then the camera comes and focuses on you, and then the person sitting in that seat ends up on the big screen. And this was incredibly effective in lots of ways. First of all, it meant that when somebody was speaking, you didn't have to rove your eye around the room to see who was speaking. You know, one of the things that I'm always so aware of in these large lecture theaters is we always talk about collaboration in higher ed, and then we put everybody in a big lecture theater, and the only person that can talk is the instructor. Because in a large lecture theater, if you don't have microphones, you can't hear anybody talk anyway. So anyway, this thing had microphones, and it had the camera that panned to the person that pressed the button. And then there was an unintended consequence or benefit of these cameras, and that is when the instructor could see some young person in row 16 who was obviously not engaged and maybe was slumped in their seat and half asleep with their baseball cap pulled down over their eyes, the instructor would say, "Mr. Jones, would you please comment on, the marketing strategy of Lululemon?" And all of a sudden, he'd press the button because he knew he had to, but he probably was in a daze and he didn't realize his mug was going to be up on the big screen. And it was like a carrot and stick game. The students actually stayed pretty engaged because they were afraid that they were going to get caught out on the big screen looking kind of sleepy. And so it was actually kind of an interesting way to get people engaged. And then in that same classroom, the students all had clickers. Actually, I should be careful here. Sometimes we use clickers and sometimes we just use pulse press. And I think the students much preferred pulse press. And that was because they were in a large lecture theater and we had a teaching assistant at the front of the room who would interrupt the lecture or the guest speaker about every maybe 7 to 9 minutes to say, here are the kinds of feeds coming in from Pulse Press like Twitter, and many people did not understand the way you presented that concept. Perhaps you could go back to it. And so it provided a really solid way to actually teach in those large lecture theaters and make sure that the students are engaged. The other thing is that when the students were on the Pulse Press, typing in things related to the thing, it meant that they weren't on Facebook. And any tactics that you can create in a large lecture theater to get people off of Facebook and to engage instead in the lecture or the conversation that's happening in the classroom is much appreciated by all.
Vivian, here's a big question. You mentioned a number of technologies that were being implemented just with those students. How would you go about measuring the effectiveness of those technologies in improving student learning? How would you know that the money that was invested was money well worth invested?
Well, that's a really good question. One of the things that the Sauder School of Business has underway, because business schools want to be accredited by the large-scale accreditors like AACSB and EQUIS, is they have an assurance of learning initiative underway that actually measures learning, not teaching, learning, which is a novel concept. The trouble with the student evaluations is often the student, I know faculty that do this. I know faculty that play the game. They bring cookies. They bring, sometimes they mark in a more generous way than they should because they are so hung up on making sure that their student evals score well. So that's kind of having, perhaps you get some information out of student evaluation, but you don't necessarily get data that helps you improve your learning. At the other end of the spectrum, this Assurance of Learning initiative, was very much a data-driven initiative where they basically evaluated the learning outcomes that the student, they basically took samples of all of the assessment activities that students were doing, and they would track them against the stated learning outcomes and use a rubric, a meta rubric, not the rubric that the instructor was using to mark the students, but a meta rubric to truly evaluate whether the stated learning outcomes were being met with the evidence of what the students were actually turning in. And so that classroom that we've just described was part of that broader assurance of learning initiative. Now, that is a very big picture and expensive approach for determining whether these technologies are working, and of course it was being done for the next round of accreditation, so not everybody's going to indulge in that. But I think that there's lots of other ways that you can measure the value, but they're more in action research and anecdotal examples. A couple of examples that I saw with the students doing this blogging thing in this particular class is their blogs were in the public domain, and some of them got picked up by newspapers and journals. So the students realized that they were writing for an audience that was more important than just their instructor. And so that really helped them up the ante on the quality of their writing and the discourse that they were engaging in these blogs, because they realized that this isn't old school where you hand in a paper and the only person that ever sees it is the TA working for the prof. Instead, it's in the public domain, and so it's important to construct my ideas in a responsible way, to write well for the web, and to bring new ideas into the conversation. So some students got published by, I don't know, Globe and Mail, or maybe even Huffington Post for all I know. But some students were actually getting published widely, and that was a huge incentive for these students to become more thoughtful in the kind of reflections that they were taking in that course.
I'm kind of curious. So you were talking about expected learning outcomes of the students and measuring those. What we're kind of wondering is we've given all of our students now have iPads. We're wondering if we are perhaps getting some unexpected learning outcomes that we are not measuring. Do you have any thoughts on how to figure out if you're teaching your students other skills that may be very important, but are not something that you traditionally would have measured?
I think that's a really great question. I mean, when I bought an iPad for myself a couple of years ago, I decided that an iPad is a game changer. And I mean, Android counts too, but the metaphor of apps is a game changer because of the personal productivity opportunities that are implicit in using those kinds of lightweight tools, many of which are free, tools like Evernote and that kind of thing. And so perhaps learning outcomes could be revised to reflect getting through work in a more productive and efficient and effective way using some of these kinds of tools. Because I really think that that's what's expected in the workplace. Why wouldn't we expect it of our learners?
Then are we changing our the way we're measuring students based on what they're learning, rather than us teaching what we want them to learn, by going, okay, well, they've learned this, so we'll now incorporate that into our thing so that we can show that we're successful?
Well, I mean, that's a really important question, and that, I think, depends on how VP academics and the governance around the process of curriculum, course outlines, learning outcomes, and what kind of a quality review process goes into that. So that's a really important question and a whole area onto its own. I have to say that my experience at SAIT, I thought that it was absolutely exemplary the way that they managed both course outlines in terms of having common standards, the process of curriculum approval, and that whole meta approach to curriculum was really done in an exceptional way, I think, at SAIT. There's other people in the room that were close to that, and Brad, you might want to comment, but my experience was that was by far the best approach to curriculum excellence that I've seen in any of the universities I've worked in, because it was systematized and everybody knew that they had to play with.
Vivian, let me ask you a bit of a controversial question. At the very beginning of your presentation, you said that technology should be the bread and butter of our life. So, I mean, obviously you're quite dedicated to technology, I understand that. But I do sometimes wonder if leadership in higher education is chasing technology use as a proxy for the human experience of learning.
Well, I don't think so. I think that if they were, they'd be making much greater investment in it, for heaven's sakes. I mean, look, we're on a Skype call right now, and we are shrinking distance by having this conversation. And while we're talking, Doug is pulling up stuff off the internet to share with you about some of the things that we're referencing. We're having a technology-enabled learning experience right now, but I don't think it is inhibiting our personal interaction. I'd love to be able to go for coffee or a beer after this session with each and all of you. I know we can't do that. That's where the real personal stuff happens. But this is pretty good, and I don't think that it inhibits the personal here at all. That would be my personal opinion. And we also know from the research that, whether it be Carol Twig's work or many others, that in terms of the learning, there's no appreciable difference between a technology-enhanced learning experience and one that doesn't have technology. I mean, part of the reality is that we don't have a lot of data that fairly compares those two worlds, but certainly the stuff that's been done in the last 10 years says there's no appreciable difference. So a technology-enabled learning experience is not a sub-learning experience. At least that's what the research says.
I guess that I may have not worded the question as clearly as I had intended, because the fact that the technology enables substitution and eliminating time and distance is one thing. The substitution of technology for the people in the learning environment is a different question.
So give me an example of what you're talking about.
I don't think I want to go to MOOCs because I'm pretty clearly aligned on that. It's also has been delivery mechanism. Okay, I'll and maybe this is a completely different question, but I have taught a project management class in my life before, and I have had students walk through the experience of actually mapping out a critical path for project delivery. Let's use that as an example. And I've deliberately asked them to map out that project using paper and using kind of the old school decision points, because I want them to actually think about the interrelationships so they better understand, so that they understand better what it is they need to think about, as opposed to simply plugging data into Microsoft Project, having a chart appear, and then go, good, there's my project, when that doesn't really give them the intellectual understanding of what it is that they need to deliver. And so when we substitute technologies as tools and productivity tools to get us to a certain point, do we remove ourselves from actually having to think about what we need to know to end up with the end product? I think that's my question.
Well, you and I share a very common dislike of I'm with you 200% on what you've just said. Because when you do project planning, it absolutely has to be a collaborative experience. So whenever I do project planning with people, we get out a big, huge piece of butcher paper, we get a bunch of yellow stickies, and it's really about the people and the conversations of creating the project plan, not the final representation. If you give somebody MS Project, they're going to go sit at their desk and do a project plan, and they're not going to have the same kind of rich conversations that happen around a big long table with a piece of butcher paper. So I'm with you all the way. once again, it's applying the right tool to the job, and some of them are technology mediated and some of them are not. I think that that same project planning process could be done at distance, but not using MS Project. MS Project is the end point, not the beginning point of project planning, in my opinion. It is after everybody has had those negotiations about scope and deliverables that then maybe you render it as a long-term management tool. But the actual ideation and design thinking that goes into a project, you need other kinds of tools, and some of those could be technology mediated in order to build that kind of collaboration.
Okay, so I'm going to take that example and then turn it around back to faculty and the resistance that faculty can have. Because from a student perspective, there's a tremendous amount of resistance to actually working something out in a butcher block paper environment, because what comes back to you as a faculty member is, we can use a computer to do that. Why would we do this? And you have to be fairly persuasive in convincing them that they are going to learn something different by scoping it out in a physical way that engages the thought process and understands, so that your computer, your own internal computer, understands the steps as clearly as the machinery does. And we get very excited by the apps this and the apps that, but I'm sure anybody in this room can say, if I hand out an exam and I ask my students to calculate some basic margin questions in a 100-level marketing exam, and it's something that I've done clearly so that all they have to do is move the decimal point so that they're multiplying tenths, they cannot do the math without a calculator, because the technology has supplanted the thinking process. And when we talk about technology use in higher education, we tend to get enamored with the tools as somehow an enabler of learning when we become a substitute for learning. And I'm not a Luddite, but I do see that in the classroom.
One thing that's interesting is I kind of see the opposite, where somebody who does not know technology very well, is spending a long time writing down notes that's going to be put up on a board, rather than taking out their iPhone, taking a quick picture of it, and having it for later reference and putting it into a OneNote document or something like that. So that you have to know kind of both sides.
I don't disagree, but and maybe I work at Camosun College in Victoria, so let's put some, so you'll know Camosun, being at Royal Roads. Given the financial pressures that higher education is under today, there's a tendency to have a perspective that technology can replace the human costs required for the delivery of education. And so the efficiencies that technology is presented as providing are often looked at as a method to remove more and more of the human cost of education, because education is a high-cost exercise at the human level. And so from that standpoint, technology is, I do think, is sometimes seen as a solution to a financial problem, which is represented in the human expense as opposed to as an enabler. And the translation of how technology can be used to support learning isn't occurring as much as the use of technology to reduce costs.
Well, and that is why we're having this conversation, because everybody in the room is doing their Ed.D because they're interested, I presume, in informing policy about exactly these kinds of questions. And I would agree with you completely that, I enroll in MOOCs quite frequently just to see what's going on in various MOOCs. I'm involved in one right now at UBC on climate change, and I'm interested to see what the instructional design approach is, what the media approach is, how the participants are interacting, all that kind of stuff. And these MOOCs that I've been involved with are very expensive to build. Make no mistake. I've run instructional design teams for years, and I've estimated that each course that I put up in my under-financed university is cost between $30,000 and $60,000 to put up an online course, and the MOOCs that I've been in must be at least $100,000 worth of labor to create what I've seen. So there is a big cost, I would agree. And so if we're talking about policy, and put yourself in the shoes of a chancellor, a president, or a VP academic, these are the kinds of conversations that need to be had, that just throwing technology at something without all the pieces that go with it doesn't make it better. If you want to create a fully online university, you're going to have to invest very significantly in instructional design resources to turn face-to-face learning into the more explicit examples that go in online learning. So the investment that needs to be made to actually make these environments good to great is very significant.
Vivian, our time is catching us here, so I just have a couple of quick questions for you. I talked to you earlier this morning about the Learning Technologies Framework.
Yes.
Which is the assignment that I think probably a few people in this class may be working on at this moment. I'm not sure. I think it's a distinct possibility. Can you comment on, and this kind of started, genesis of this was what we were doing at SAIT. And can you comment on how something like that might be relevant for a higher ed institution and the kinds of experiences you've had with similar initiatives?
Well, I think this learning framework thing that you're working on is really important because it's the precursor to a service catalog. And, I've been through a few rounds of the ITEL training. Some of you may be familiar with that. That is the service management thing in IT. But I think those of us that work in educational technology and learning design have really co-opted the idea of a service catalog, because in our institutions we need to be clear: what technologies do we support? Who does the support? What's the service levels that we provide? To whom? Is it to students? Is it to faculty? Is it to the entire institution? And what don't we provide? And that's the most difficult part of this. And so a service catalog, a learning technology framework that evolves into a service catalog, I think is absolutely foundational to everything we're talking about here. Because the institution needs to have conversations about where the soft spot is between innovation and the practical reality of institutional support of technologies. There are many technologies, let's say Google, that may sit outside, unless your institution has actually formally gone Google. The use of a lot of Google tools may sit in what you might call an innovation portfolio that has different kinds of service level commitments than the commitment that you would have with your learning management system. So taking that learning technologies framework, then doing further categorization into tools and technologies that are institutionally supported versus those that I will call are prototype or experimental, and what kind of support you offer in each of those categories, and what you are going to say no to as well. The whole area of rich media, videography, and let's even go so far as to say Second Life. I mean, a few years ago, lots of places were throwing a bunch of resources and experimenting with Second Life and these kinds of immersive environments. And, should that be in your service catalog or not? Well, if you've got lots of resources, maybe it could be. But if you are with a bare bones educational technology support group, you might want to be absolutely clear in your institution to say, no, we're not into avatars here. Sorry, you can go play with that in your spare time, but we're not going to provide any support. So that learning technology framework that you're working on is a core piece of the leadership and administration of these kinds of portfolios. Does that give you any further incentive to complete the assignment?
Yeah.
Should have had you on last week.
Actually, a good place to see a service catalog is if you go to UBC IT and I don't know, put service catalog or whatever into the search. At UBC, we spent a lot of time getting a service catalog underway that spanned both IT and educational technology. And it's been socialized heavily throughout the institution that, these are the technologies we support. And if it's not here, well, you can go figure it out yourself, but we don't support it. So I think it's an important thing because we can't be everything to all people all the time. We live with very limited resources.
Okay, we'll have a peek at that. We have one more question for you from Rob Carver.
Pretty scary. I'm right in the foreground here.
There you go.
Hey, Rob, this is the first time I've even seen you.
I've been doing my best. Stay out of the picture. We had an interesting role-play exercise here yesterday in which we were conducting interviews with various stakeholders about cloud-based technology, and I think that's why Doug has asked me to ask you this question. And so the question is, what policies do you have in place at Royal Roads related to cloud-based technologies, example, privacy and security?
Well, first of all, Royal Roads hardly uses any cloud-based services, much to my chagrin. But what I've just done is on privacy, I've created with the institutional lawyer a consent form that basically says my instructor as part of this course may require me to use a social media tool or application that is sitting on a server that isn't in Canada, and I can consent or I cannot consent to the use of that tool. Now, what we're hoping is that it'll only be on an exception basis that people say I don't consent. But this was our way in British Columbia, where there is much more of a rigorous approach to this FOIP thing, to open up access to the kinds of tools that most students and most faculty would like to be able to use. So that's what we've done on the FOIP side of the house. In terms of security, I don't know if you've been following it, but there's been a couple of really interesting articles in Chronicle of Higher Ed and a couple of other publications over the last 2 or 3 days about how universities are seriously being hacked, and that some universities are even going so far as to not allow any faculty or staff to take laptops off the campus because of the hacking issues. So it's just been stuff that I've been reading just literally in the last couple of days. Apparently, this is a bunch of hackers that are based in China that use a circuitous approach through many different countries, and sometimes they're hard to track, and they're doing security hacking in universities. So I think it is a very legitimate issue that we need to be aware of. But once again, you try to, in limited budgets, you try to address these kinds of things, and people go, well, this is nice, but they glaze over. Let me give you an example. One of the first questions I asked when I got to Royal Roads was, where's our data center? And what is our business continuity plan in case of a flood or an earthquake? And hello, climate change or whatever. Oh, sorry, I'm talking Alberta. I've got to be careful talking about climate change. Sorry. I know it's considered a religion in some parts in Alberta, so I don't want to get into religion. But anyway, when we see floods like what we've seen in Calgary recently, and the Sandy issue in New York and all the rest of it, I think we need to say very seriously, how are we dealing with business continuity in our universities around these kinds of things, and ask the questions. Back to shared services, I would like to say that universities should have a cloud strategy at the provincial level where stuff is managed and kept in other places, so that should there be some kind of disaster, that recovery can happen quickly. When I asked this question at Royal Roads, they said to me, well, we send our tape backups to University of Northern British Columbia. I thought, well, that's nice, but that's not going to help you get up and running very fast, because I need an environment that has a certain version of Red Hat Linux running on it to load those tapes on to get my Moodle instance back up and running quickly. Where are you going to do that? And nobody has an answer for me. So I actually think we're in an interesting time here where we could actually get shared services underway because of some of these external factors that say you better plan for tornadoes, floods, and other acts of God in order to keep your learning environments up and running. So let's see what happens on that. And the security issue, I don't even know what to say on it, because with people running around like Snowden and people like that and WikiLeaks and all the rest of it, I don't know. I don't think Obama has an answer, let alone little old me.
Our follow-up question was, if you were a cloud, what kind of a cloud would you be?
Well, I see that Judy Collins, the folk singer from my youth, is singing at a folk festival in Duncan this weekend. So I would, like Judy Collins, look at clouds from both sides now.
Excellent.
Oh, very good. Vivian, thank you so much. That was I didn't even prompt you for that. No, that was really good. We really appreciate you being here. I had mentioned to you that I was going to record this. I did not ask your permission.
Oh,
We have an extra 4.
Someone could take a picture of it with their iPhone.
Have a look at
There you go.
this. Give us your verbal
okay.
consent.
I've just put my signature on it. There you go.
Anyway, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your time in Saskatoon and safe travels back to Victoria.
Okay, and thank you, everybody. Nice to meet you. And one of the things that I do more than I actually do my real-world job at Royal Roads or any other university is I maintain my network of contacts in this business, because I find the greatest strength and innovation comes from knowing people like you. So you can all easily find me on LinkedIn, and if you're so inclined, connect with me, because I find it great to be able to find people again to talk about how we solve cloud issues, instructional design, learning outcome, and how to deal with apps with millennials. So nice to meet you all, and I hope that our paths cross in new ways.
Thanks.
And thank you, Doug. Bye now. I'm going to go out into the yard. It's absolutely beautiful here in Saskatoon, and help my mother in the garden.
Okay, good stuff.
Okay, see you later. Bye now.
Bye.